I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Whadjuk people in the Perth region. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution that they make to the life of this city and this region. Professor Smith was the federal member for Perth for the Australian Labor Party from March 1993 until September 2013. In a distinguished career spanning 20 years in the Australian Federal Parliament, Professor Smith served as the Minister for Defence and prior to that as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Trade. There are 193 countries in the world, and in his political and academic careers, Professor Smith would have been to almost all of them, making him very well qualified indeed to address this evening's topic, Australia and the Indo-Pacific. So please welcome Professor Stephen Smith.
Well, thanks very much, Ivy. I'm very pleased to be here. Can I thank Fabian's WA for the invitation and also acknowledge the support of this event by Labor for Aid. Can I also pay my respects to the Noongar people, their elders past and present, and given that we're situated in premises very close to Union's WA building, can I also note the passing of Tony Cook and acknowledge the great contribution that he made to the trade union movement in Western Australia, to the labour movement generally, and also for just being generally a terrifically fine human being. And it was very sad to see his tragic passing in recent days. I might just give you an outline of what I've done since I retired, because that then lets you know where I'm coming from, because with any public policy matter, whether it's international relations or domestic, it's always helpful to know where the arguer is coming from. Where you sit often depends upon where you stand. So when I retired, I did the sensible thing, painted the house with Jane, went overseas, did nothing for a while, and then went back to the University of Western Australia. Decades ago, I was a tutor of public international law. I did my master's degree in public international law at London School of Economics at the LSE. And so the university invited me to come back to be a professor. That bemused me because I knew less about public international law then than I did when I was a tutor, but nonetheless, this is how things work. So that keeps me involved in international law issues and international relations. And so I'll do things like run a course on the law of the sea and the South China Sea and spend half an hour explaining why the Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision on the South China Sea, China and the Philippines was 110% absolutely correct, and then spend a half an hour putting on my international relations practitioner's cap, telling people why China and the rest of the world ignored it completely. Or do something on the International Court of Justice and then go through the Australia versus Japan whaling case and then go through all of the diplomacy that went on behind the scenes by either myself or Peter Garrett, who was then the Environment Minister. So that keeps me interested and engaged in international relations matters. And as Ivy said, I'm also on the board of the Perth US Asia Centre, which is a think tank based at UWA, whose mission is to essentially look at the Australia-US alliance relationship, but from the perspective, not of Sydney or the Pacific, but from the perspective of Perth and the Indian Ocean, looking into South Asia, ASEAN and Southeast Asia, not just into the Pacific and North Asia. And as a consequence of that, I've spent a lot of my time since I retired thinking and visiting and doing events, etc., on both Indonesia and ASEAN and also India. I've done other bits and pieces. I'm on the board of a not-for-profit called the LNG Marine Fuels Institute, which is aimed at getting all of our large marine transport ships off diesel onto LNG. You only need one fact to be interested in that, and that's one of our carrier ship container fleets, so it might be LNG or iron ore, taking iron ore or LNG from Perth to Japan, Korea or China, puts more sulphur dioxide into the atmosphere than all of the cars produced in the world since 2014. So we're trying to get them off diesel onto LNG, not just to get the sulphur dioxide out of the atmosphere, but also nitrogen dioxide and carbon dioxide. But in addition to those matters, I of course retain my lifelong interest in matters Australian Labor Party. So I'm now I was what they call a member of the Central Branch for a couple of years while you find your feet after being a member of the FPLP. And now I'm a diligent, non-attending, card-carrying member of the North Perth Branch. I take an interest, obviously, in what Tim Hammond and the local members, my local member Simon Millman, do, and the activities of the North Perth Branch. So I've given a shout out to the Perth US Asia Centre. You're here and obviously interested in international relations matter. You should jump onto the Perth US Asia Centre, subscribe to its emails, and look at the events and the functions and the lectures, etc., that we conduct, and also the materials and publications that we produce. There's also a shout out for the Western Australian Branch's International Affairs Committee. The convener, Hugo, is here. So those of you who are ALP matters, you should talk to the convener about what the committee's doing. Those of you who are not ALP members can either A, join, or B, jump on the Perth US Asia website. So that's enough of the CV and the preliminaries. When Ivy said I've got to be out here at 7, that's code for I really need to be walking out the door sometime between 8 minutes and 10 past. So it's about 10 past now. I thought I might go to sort of 20 or 25 minutes and then just have a conversation, do some questions and answers. And if we wind up around 7, Ivy, I should be safe for my next gig. So the title, Australia and the Indo-Pacific. What's the Indo-Pacific all about? Why would anyone be interested in what looks like a funny abbreviation of Indonesia and India and the Pacific? Well, the story essentially goes like this in geostrategic terms. At the end of the last century, we'd seen the end of World War II, the Cold War period, a geostrategic period where essentially there were only two great players or powers, the United States and Russia. We, of course, have got a long-standing post-war strategic and economic relationship with the United States, but not much of a relationship with Russia. Nor did Russia have much economic impact on our part of the world, or much of the world other than itself and Europe. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, essentially saw one great power sort of running geostrategic matters, so the United States. And that occurred for a brief historical period of time. But towards the end of last century, people started to say what Australia had realised for some time, which is there's this great rising power of 1.2 billion people called China. And Australian diplomacy and Australian geostrategic analysis has always been very good at getting onto things on the ground floor or in the basement, seeing sort of great changes down the horizon. And we were, you'll remember, one of the first countries to recognise China with a one China policy. Those of you who are old enough, and it looks like there's me and 2 or 3 others, will remember that Gough Whitlam, as leader of the opposition, went to China and announced in China that if he was elected to government, which he was in December 1972, that he would recognise China with a one China policy. He was widely and roundly condemned by all concerned until about 6 days later, Richard Nixon popped up in China doing exactly the same thing. So we've been good at seeing the early rise of things. So towards the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, people started to say, well, great change is occurring. Looks like we're going to call this the China century. And people became very conscious of the rise of another great economic and security and strategic power. Some people, again including Australian diplomacy, said, well, all of that is true, but the United States' economic and geostrategic power will be eclipsed as a consequence of the rise of another great power, but it's not going to disappear. The United States economically and geostrategically is not going to go away, and that will apply irrespective of who might be the president for a 4 or 8 year period. So Australian diplomacy started to say this won't be the China century, this will be the Asia-Pacific century. And that was underpinned by some of the things which the Hawke-Keating government did in the 1990s with us, through Paul Keating, urging Bill Clinton to transform APEC from a trading ministers-based organisation across the Asia-Pacific to a leaders-based organisation across the Pacific. So APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Community, as the nomenclature stands for. So for a while we started talking about this will be the Asia-Pacific century. And then, again, although there are a lot of people who take credit for this or try and say we were the first ones, Australian diplomacy started to say, well, hang on, more is occurring. There's another country of 1.2 billion people, which is a democracy, the world's largest democracy, and that appears to be stirring economically and strategically as well. It's called India. And so we started to say, well, isn't it going to be the case that in the course of this century, there's potentially going to be three great powers, United States, China and India. Now, countries can always fail, big countries or small countries. So in the 1890s, for example, a lot of the economic analysis said there are going to be two shining economies from small population countries in the 1900s. It'll be Australia and Argentina. Well, Australia took its chance and Argentina didn't. As a consequence, Australia's in the G20, we're the top 13th or 14th or 15th economy, and Argentina is only now starting to seriously drive economic growth. So you can miss your chance and you can fail. But all of the longer term geo/macroeconomic predictions generally land about here, saying that by the time you get to 2050, there'll be three great economies, China, US and India, not necessarily in that order. So two countries of 1.2 billion people, India, by the way, with a better population demographic, and the United States, 250 to 300, maybe 350 million people, but with lots of decades of intense scientific research, creative endeavour. It's hard to see that going away. But those same economic predictions also say by the time you get to 2050, somewhere between 2040 and 2050, if current population and economic projections are right, then the fourth largest economy in the world will be Indonesia. And if not Indonesia by itself, then Indonesia with the ASEAN Economic Community. And so when people started to say, okay, some great economic long-term strategic shift is occurring in the Indian Ocean, with India in particular, and Indonesia and ASEAN as well, then that's not the Pacific, that's the Indian Ocean. So hence, we struck upon the phraseology Indo-Pacific, which essentially it's not intended to be a piece of, as we say in the trade, a piece of the regional architecture. It's not intended to be ASEAN formalised. It's not intended to be the Indian Ocean Rim Association. It's not intended to be the Pacific Island Forum. It's just a geostrategic description of where the world is going. And I was tutored by Ivy in this. Hopefully this will work. There we go. So this is a map which illustrates what the thesis is. And you can see the importance of the position of Australia in that. The Pacific and the United States, of course, as you face the screen, is to my right and your right. Just take that as a given. And if you look at this one, which it's slightly dated, but you'll get the general idea, these are the sea lanes. In other words, these are where all the traffic goes, all the trade and investment traffic. So you can see the very thick lines from North America across the Pacific to North Asia, Japan, China, Korea, but also going down to Southeast Asia, and traffic coming through from Europe across to India, through the Malacca Straits. And you can see the heavy concentration of traffic through the South China Sea, hence the strategic importance of that area. But this slide it's a few years old now, and what it does, you can see the great trade traffic from the Pacific to North Asia and the great trade traffic around North Asia. The lines that you see going from Europe to India and India to Indonesia and Indonesia to North Asia and the Pacific, as we speak, they're thickening. they're growing larger. You might just see on the map, there's a line which goes from the northwest of Western Australia up towards Indonesia. That's called iron ore and liquefied natural gas. So the two great post-World War II resource industries that we've effectively created. And so coming back to the first, actually I'll go to, that's a bit more definition. In Perth, we say Perth is the closest capital city. That presupposes that Darwin's not a capital city. So you can see the carry, all those in here. And this one you see, that's a sort of an atlas type view. You can see Australia in its sort of proper geostrategic place with India having sort of just come adrift of us, thousands of years ago. But that gives you a snapshot of what we mean by the Pacific Ocean and the importance. We're a one country, one island, one continent, but we've got a western seaboard and an eastern seaboard, and the western seaboard is only going to grow in importance. And I'll just make this point in passing. The Indo-Pacific also the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific also touches upon the east coast of Africa. And if you're looking at economic and strategic cabs off the rank, after Indonesia and ASEAN and after India, the next big cab off the rank will be Africa. Now, Africa is a continent of 1.2 billion people, not a country of 1.2 billion people, but they do take the notion of the African Union seriously. And already from Western Australia in particular, but Australia in general, into Africa, you've got over $20 billion worth of minerals, resources, investment, mineral services investment. And that is mirroring what occurred with iron ore into Japan and Korea and China, and LNG into Japan, Korea and China. Western Australian mining companies are now essentially saying there are vast tracts of Africa where the topography and the geology are very reminiscent and similar to what we've experienced in Western Australia. Ivy's nodding, she's a geo. And there are every year in Perth there's a conference called Africa Down Under, which is essentially a mining conference. It started off in a shoebox, now it goes for about 3 days and it takes over the entire Pan-Pacific, the old Sheraton and the Novotel next door. Half a dozen African mining ministers come down, state and Commonwealth ministers go, there's about 2,000 people. And so last year when I went, the investment into Africa was 20 billion. So that's a good news story because for whatever criticisms Australian minerals resources might get from time to time, it's a world-class industry, centuries of experience, and our industry here, sometimes too slowly, has come to the conclusion that if you want to be a successful mineral or petroleum resources industry, then you've got to be a good friend of the indigenous occupiers of the land, a good friend of the local community, and a good friend of the environment. And if you do those three things, then you've got a reasonable chance of being a good friend of your shareholder. Otherwise, you're going to get into trouble. And minerals is not just sort of digging holes in the ground. The only reason our iron ore export industry is competitive, as against the Brazilians, is not because of either the quality of the iron ore or where we dig it up. We dig it up in inland deposits. The Brazilians dig theirs up on the coast. The only thing that makes our iron ore industry competitive is the world's most effective and efficient computerised railway line that takes the deposits to the coast and then tips them in. That's essentially it. And that sort of automated railway line and system is run out of boxes near Perth Airport. And you see vast efforts of R&D, scientific and engineering ingenuity going into both our iron ore and LNG industry. So these are not sort of rock-kicking exercises. These are vastly complex, vastly complicated, sophisticated scientific endeavours. And my own view is that it's having those two industries, iron ore and LNG, which has formed a platform for us having now extensive trade and investment relationships with China and Japan, and to a lesser extent the Republic of Korea, South Korea. So if you subscribe to that sort of, this is what's happening in the world's economy, then you're a devotee, as I am, of the notion of the Indo-Pacific. The first time an Australian Commonwealth government document referred formally to the Indo-Pacific was in the 2010 Defence White Paper, and in the recent Foreign Policy White Paper, which came down late last year, so 2017, you could be forgiven for thinking that that Foreign Policy White Paper only spoke about two things: one, the Indo-Pacific, and two, an international rules order-based system. So we've now essentially attached ourselves to the notion of the Indo-Pacific, and we argue that, whether it's Perth US Asia Centre, whether it's the Labor Party, whether it's the Commonwealth of Australia, argue that to our neighbours in the region. When I was Foreign and Defence Minister, you get pushback from that notion from ASEAN and India and other countries. Now you get pushed over in the rush of who thought of it first. Who thought of it first? Now, it assumes a number of things. It assumes that Indonesia and ASEAN will continue to grow economically. The other country that you want to watch in ASEAN, yes, you've got some old and stable, sort of old ASEAN economies and players, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand in particular. But you've got sort of some new young tigers. You hear a lot of people talking about Myanmar as being as a potential great small economy, and that's true. But the one you want to watch is Vietnam, and you want to watch Vietnam because I suspect many people in the room will be surprised. Vietnam is a country that currently has 95 million people in it. So Vietnam is a country of 100 million people, and they want prosperity. They're chasing prosperity. They're chasing economic growth. The Politburo of the Vietnamese Communist Party didn't sign up for the TPP because they thought they were being ideologically pure. They did that because they thought it would be in Vietnam's long-term national economic interests. They're chasing prosperity. So, and Australia's well placed to try and take advantage of that. We've got a lot of expatriate Vietnamese communities. The Vietnamese hold us in high standing. They talk about the American War. They regard our role in that as being an accepted fact of history. They regard our military involvement as fair and honourable, and there are lots of potential for trade and investment engagement between Australia and Vietnam. But it assumes that Indonesia doesn't fail as a country or as an economy, and it assumes that India takes its rightful place as a great power, not just as the leader of the non-aligned movement. It's possible that Indonesia could fail as a country, but we've now seen in Indonesia SBY elected democratically 2 terms in a row. We've seen SBY hand over to the democratically elected Jokowi. We saw Prabowo think about, maybe disputing that and folding his cards. And the next Indonesian president will be democratically elected. So democracy, I think, is pretty well established in Indonesia. When Lee Kuan Yew died, people reminded us of his old adage that he was sort of both saddened initially and surprised that Singapore had become a country in its own right. I think the greater marvel is that Indonesia became and remains a country in its own right. And in terms of being on the ground floor, Australia, of course, was one of the countries who came to Indonesia's defence and support when Indonesia was seeking independence at the end of World War II. Our trade union movement blockaded Dutch ships who were seeking to repatriate Dutch soldiers to Indonesia and arms and munitions. Under a UN mandate, the fledgling UN, Australian troops on the ground were the first in Indonesia under the UN committee to separate the fledgling Indonesian forces and the Dutch forces. So the Indonesians understand that we were there when they were fighting for their independence. So we've got that on our side. The reality is, though, if you look at our trade and investment figures with Indonesia, they are paltry compared to what they should be as our nearest neighbour. Indonesia, 300 million people, they'll grow to 350 million people. We should be doing much better in a trade and investment sense with Indonesia than we are. India, Modi understands that India now needs to conduct itself like a great power, not the leader of the non-aligned movement. One of Modi's predecessors had a policy which was called Look East. not dissimilar to the sorts of approaches that some of us took in foreign policy in Australia by saying we need to look west to India. Modi's adage is act east, don't look east, act east. So he's now trying to enwrap himself into the ASEAN economy, the East Asian economy, China, Japan, Korea, and also the United States. So I don't think India will fail as an economy or a great power, nor do I think that Indonesia will fail as an economy and a great power. It's also not always the case that a big population and a strong economy brings you geostrategic weight, but it pretty well follows. It pretty well follows. When you come to Australia, what's made Australia, such a great country and a prosperous place to be? Two things. Firstly, we've been a great trading power or a great trading nation, and secondly, we've been an attractive place for overseas direct capital investment. So we're a small population country, 25 million, less than 25 million. Even on the most ambitious or enthusiastic or optimistic population scenarios, by the time Indonesia's 350 million plus, we'll be, on a good day, we'll be 35 million. So we are a small population country, and our population is centred on a half a dozen coastal population centres. But despite our small population and large landmass, we've become, a very prosperous country. So per capita, we're a big winner in the GDP per capita. So we sit in the top 13 or 14 economies, depending upon what day of the week it is. We're the 12th largest defence and peacekeeping spender. We're one of the significant players in regional and multilateral forums. So we're a small population country, but we've got a few things going for us. And you'll remember the great phrase from my old boss, Paul Keating, that, we punch above our weight. The truth is we don't. We conduct ourselves as the 13th largest economy in the world should conduct itself. Our challenge will be, will we remain in the top 20 economies as countries with bigger populations start to grow their economies? So there are plenty of countries in Africa with big populations who you have to expect over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years will end up having a bigger economy than Australia. In the blink of an eye, Indonesia will have a bigger economy than Australia. So we might be pushed down, or almost certainly will be pushed down the G20 table. There'll be some elements of relativity about that, but how do we make sure that we retain our prosperity, whether we're in the G20 or the G30? Well, we have to continue to be a great trading nation. Post-World War II, we became exporters of iron ore and liquefied natural gas, and then elaborately transformed manufacturers and services. Quite remarkable that we had a formal trade agreement with Japan 12 years after the end of a bitter war in the Pacific. Quite remarkable, quite remarkable. And that really was the thing that got us going post-World War II. Iron ore into Japan, then LNG into Japan. And we've also been an attractive place for overseas capital investment. And you can track the foreign investment into Australia historically. Big from the UK, virtually nothing from anyone else. Big from the UK and big from the US. And then you start to see big from Japan, modest from Korea, a smaller country, and then off a low base, China, our highest increase, rising foreign investor. But where will the next big lick of foreign investment come? We don't have the population or the economic horsepower to raise the capital that we need to continue our prosperity and to grow it. So some of it's got to come from overseas, despite the growth of the Australian superannuation industry and investment potential. Well, if you agree with the thesis that I subscribe to, it can only come from Indonesia and ASEAN, it can only come from India, and ultimately it can only come from Africa. Because there comes a point in time with developed, sophisticated economies where they have to send money offshore and invest it offshore to balance their economy. So they make investments offshore strategically as a country. Sure, we have investments from Indonesia and India. That's my alarm telling me I have to stop soon, if I could stop the alarm. you see trickles of investment from Singapore. Well, actually, there's quite a big investment from Singapore when you look at the stats, but that masks investment from India and Indonesia. But you see a trickle of foreign investment from Indonesia and India, but there'll come a point in time where, as a matter of necessity, those economies will have to be driven by the state investing overseas. If we're not careful, when India and Indonesia come to do big structural investments offshore, they won't look south, they'll look north. They'll look to North America and North Asia and Europe. So we have to get our share of that. We've got to have the Indonesians and the Indians looking south and from their perspective east. Because if we don't, then what will occur with our direct foreign investment here is what has historically occurred. UK, big increases, plateau. US, big increases, plateau. Japan, big increase, plateau, although it is the case that Japanese investment in Australia started to rise again. Korea, rise, plateau. China, still on the rise. India, off a low base, coming up. Next to no investment from Indonesia. Either way, Australia into Indonesia and vice versa. Some investment from India into Australia, not much investment from Australia into India. Perversely, we've got more investment in Africa than we do in Indonesia and India combined in terms of outward flows of Australian investment, and that's all down to mining. Now, I think this is a big economic and psychological challenge for Australia. My thesis is that if you look at what we export now to China and to Japan, Korea and other countries, the starting point for that was having that railway line track of minerals and petroleum resources exports going to Japan, going to Tokyo, then to Seoul, then to Beijing. And so with that backbone, other industries, other endeavour, other activity, other business, ingenuity and investment started to flow. Indonesia and India don't want our iron ore or LNG in the same way that China, Japan and Korea wanted them. So we have to adopt a completely new psychological approach to investing in those countries. So what are the things that we could bring if they don't want our iron ore or LNG? India takes a fair bit of our gold for jewellery purposes. It's doing the sorts of things that Australians are very good at. So minerals and petroleum services is one thing, but in some respects, more importantly, our education services. Despite all of the criticisms of education or health or other areas of activity in Australian society, we're world class. So education activities, this is why you've seen universities and TAFEs looking at international students and international collaborations. Healthcare, professional services, whether you're lawyers or whether you are sort of the professional services people, urban developers, all of the things that we take for granted in Australian society are there as potential for activity, trade and investment as Indonesia and India have a growing and burgeoning middle class. And so when those populations, so flick open any website, the estimate for Southeast Asian middle class over the next 20 years is growth by anywhere from sort of 3 to 500 million. India is sort of anyone's guess. So there's plenty of potential, but we haven't yet scratched the surface. A problem with India is, where do you start? A country of 1.2 billion people. Where do you, as the Swedes would say, what's the first bit of the elephant that you bite off? So these are challenges for us. My argument and my sort of analysis is that if we miss those opportunities, then that will be at great risk of our prosperity. And the only end result of Australia not trading and investment two ways with Indonesia and India and ultimately Africa and also a country like Vietnam, then in the end what will suffer will be the prosperity that we've become used to over the last 20 or 30 years. Our economy, our lifestyle, our quality of life for most people in Australia is significantly higher than what it was when I was growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s, and the opening up the economy by the Hawke-Keating government, doing a whole range of things which has led to, from literally from the end of World War II on, developing new industries into North Asia, opening up our economy. These are the things which now drive growth and prosperity here. So we've got to find the next sources, and to me, the only place I can find those on the map is in our part of the world. And so not only is this a necessity and a great opportunity for Australia, it's also a fantastic opportunity for Perth and Western Australia, because we are now not the most isolated capital city in the world. We are right at the southern fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So in the geostrategic context, you may have seen over the Anzac Day period a report come out from the United States saying, gee, that naval base in Perth looks like it's really important from a strategic point of view. So maybe there might be the odd US ship that goes through there. Or, as we've been arguing to the Indian Navy and the Indian government for more than half a decade, it would be good to see some collaboration between the Indian Navy and Australia through HMAS Sterling south of Frio, and the same with the Indonesian Navy. So both from a strategic and security sense, but also from a economic and prosperity sense. Perth has got lots of proximity and time zone advantages to try and take advantage of the growth of these great economies. Now, whether we can do that will be a challenge to all of us who live here. In Indonesia and India, we continue to be skinned by Melbourne and Sydney because we're not known or recognised, whereas Melbourne and Sydney are sort of icons of the population centres. Sometimes it's hard to trump the Melbourne Cup and hard to trump the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But I go to Singapore, Jakarta, Surabaya, Delhi, and people have to scratch their heads and sort of get an education when you say, do you want to send your kids to the same time zone and 4-hour or 5-hour flight, or do you want to send your kids on a 7 or 8 hour flight with a 3-hour time zone difference? Or if you're coming from India, do you want to have effectively a 5-hour time zone difference and a 7 to 8 hour flight, or do you want to have an 8 or 9 hour time difference and a 12-hour flight? So we have these advantages that we don't argue strongly enough. And we also have the quality of life advantages. I gave my best pitch to a high-wealth Indonesian businessman trying to encourage him to invest into Western Australia after I retired. So I gave him my best Indo-Pacific spiel. He looked at me and he said, "That's very good, Steve. That's very good." He said, "But you've missed the best bits." I said, "Sorry?" He said, "You've missed the best bits." I said, "And what would they be?" He said, "The best bit is this. When I go to Perth, at night I can see the stars, and during the day I can see the blue sky." So there's a quality of life thing which we take for granted, which other people are just completely gobsmacked by when they arrive. So part of our natural advantage is just the natural quality of where we live, and we need to bring that front and centre to the arguments to our neighbours that they should start thinking about trading with and investing in Perth, Western Australia and Australia. Well, thanks very much for that. I've left about 15 or so minutes for questions or criticisms or commentary or comments, so I'm very happy to have that conversation. Thanks very much.